So the past few weeks, I asked you almost every week for a few weeks to have in mind when you learn, when you daven, le'refuah shalema le'moras fradel bas Leah. So as you all know, my mother passed away last week, and that's why there were no shiurim last week. And now I ask you to bear in mind, le'ilui nishmosa shel moras fradel bas Rabbi Yonasan ben Yamin HaKohen. No longer fradel bas Leah, but fradel bas Harav Rabbi Yonasan ben Yamin HaKohen. She should be a Meretz Yosef for the Mishpocha, and we should only share B'Seiros Tovos. The Shiur today is also dedicated to Ilui Nishmas Rabbi Avram Doiv ben Reb Chaim Eliezer, the late father of our dear friend, Shiabod L'Chaim Tovim, Dr. Ari Weintraub, and his yortzeit is Kof Ches Cheshvan. Shia Meretz Yosef Mishpocha. They should only know Nachas v'Chesed. So in Chumash Bereishis we are oisik b'Maaseh Yavos. And almost every week we are oisik in different sugyas or Chaim Yeredei, primarily those that are Negei Alocha L'Maaseh. This week is a real Yeshiva Shashir, Chosh and Mishpat. So last week there were no shiurim, and we learned the sugya of Kinyas De'Efroin, Al Yedei Avraham Avinu. This week is the Kinyan HaBechorah. And in Minchas Osha and Chumash Bereishis, there are many simoni, many discussions going into the details of Zdei Efroin, of Kinyan HaBechorah. Today, we're not about details, only about the essence of Toras HaKinyanim. And not related dafka to Kinyan HaBechorah, Kinyan Zdei Efroin, but generally, Toras HaKinyan. But we will touch upon the basic question, is there a difference and the essence of Kinyanim before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah? Sefer HaChinuch writes in Mitzvah Shin Lamed Vav, Dinei Mekach Umemkar. After the Sefer Chinuch briefly mentions the various different Kinyanim and the sources, the psukim from which Chazal learned the various different Kinyanim, Kesef, Meshicha, Kinyan Chazoka Bekarka, and all the others, the Chinuch writes, Ve'ein sofek ki elu ha'kniyot kulam et kones chachamim hein. These are all tkonas chachomim midrabanan. Ve'viu aksuvim lismoch behem divreihem. And the Minchas Chinuch is baffled, is troubled. What does the Chinuch mean that the Kinyanim are midrabanan? Does that mean in a Torah there are no Kinyanim? That is totally impossible. Hello, without Kinyan there is no Bailis. Without Bailis there could be no Dina Momenis. Even before Matan Torah, one of the Sheva Mitzvahs Beinorich is Gezel. There could be no Gezel if there is no ownership. And how would we establish ownership if there are no Kinyanim? Of course Kinyanim are Mena Torah. So what does the Sefer Chinuch mean when he says all the Kniyos are Metekonas Chachomim? I suggest two different interpretations. Number one brings us to a concept which is called Kinyan Setumta, which we find one time in Shas Bava Mitziayin Daladom and Aleph. Hai Setumta Kanya. And there are different Perushim in the Rishonim, what is actually the Setumta? But the common denominator, the Tzadeh Shoveh Shebekulam, Minag HaSoichem. So most of the Rishonim explain that in the wine business, once upon a time, you used to visit the cave, the martef, the wine cellar, and you used to taste or smell the various different barrels, and the ones that appealed to you, you used to put a seal, and that seal was seen by the Soichem as a Kinyan. So Kinyan Setumta is not one specific Kinyan, but rather Poishet Surah, Loivish Surah. It all depends on what people consider as a legal transaction. So Kinyan Setumta is Minag HaSoichem. And in my Sforim, primarily Minchas Osha Bereishis, on this week's Parsha, I have a very lengthy discussion about Kinyan Setumta, but as I said today, we don't go into details. But fundamentally, basically, many explain that besides the specific Kinyanim that the Torah was Machadish, that Midrabanan were Machadish, there is a general Kinyan which is Minag HaSoichem. and any act or deed which is seen by the broad public as a kinyan becomes a kinyan. And maybe that is what the Sefer HaChinuch means. Of course, the fundamental concept of Kinyanim, of course, it's min haTorah, because otherwise there could be no Dina Momenis at all. But the various different Kinyanim are midrabanan. However, after Chachamim are metaken a Kinyan, and it becomes a minag, then once again it becomes min haTorah, like Setumta. That is one approach. But I think the more reasonable approach is based on a concept which I speak about a lot. And all my Talmidim for a while know how much importance I attach to the concept Nimsara Dovar Lechachomim. There are many areas in Torah which the Torah gives a fundamental rule, but the Torah doesn't give us the details. Neither does the Torah give us a key to understand and assume what are the details. And therefore, Nimsar Hadovar Lechachomim. And it is as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us, I give the general rule, you fill in the details. Ani va'ato nitayel began Eden. Ani va'atem niten Torah b'Yisrael. And in those instances, divrei chachomim kedivrei Torahem. And the chachomim act not only as commentators, but as legislators. And I think the same with Torah Kinyanim. It is clear that there is a concept of ownership. Otherwise, there could be no gezel. And there cannot be ownership without transactions, without Kinyanim. So what are the Kinyanim? Nimsel HaChachamim. At one Chachamim or Metakan becomes a Diuraisa. To me, that would be the more reasonable approach. So what happened before Matan Torah? Because all the Kinyanim we learn from Torah Moshe, from Nevi'im V'Ksuvim. I think before Matan Torah it is more reasonable to say that all the Kinyanim were Satumta, and the essence of Kinyan and all its details were dependent on Darkei B'nei Adam. And that is why we do not find, either by Mechiras HaBchorah or by Sdei Ephron, many details, even though I did fill in the gap. And in my Sefer on Bereshis, I went into great detail. But the more reasonable approach is, before Matan Torah, everything was a tumt, and everything depended on Das B'nei Adam. And that explains the Rivash in Simen Reish Chof Ches. Maybe Shin Chof Ches. Maybe I don't remember. I think it's Reish Chof Ches. Dealing with the question, Kinyan HaBchorah, you know the Makna Dova Shel B'Riolam, and as long as your father is alive, there is no B'chorah. The Rivash quotes a Rosh, disagrees, and the Rivash says, before Matan Torah, or the Makna Dova Shel B'Riolam, and many Achronim don't understand. What is the difference? And I say, before Matan Torah, Torah Kinyanim was not yet given. There was no Torah Kinyanim. And the essence of Kinyan was minag. And if the minag is to be Makna Dova Shel B'Riolam, then let it be, then it becomes the halacha as well. So this is a major discussion in Rishonim and in Achronim. By Setumta, is a Setumta valid by Dova Shel B'Riolam? And many say yes, and that is based on what I just explained. If a Kinyan is totally dependent on Das B'nei Adam, then it all depends how people relate to the Kinyan, and it could be valid even by Dova Shaloi Boli Yolam. Which brings us to the most fundamental question in Torah Kinyanim. And here there are two different approaches. One is Medivrei Rabbeinu Gedola Adoros, and I want to quote about 6 or 7 names, starting with the Chazon Ish, not in the chronological order. Chazon Ish Choshen Mishpat Chav Beis quotes his father. I think it's the only time in the Chazon Ish which he not only quotes Torah in the name of his father, but actually uses his father's words, what his father wrote. Klal Godel Yeh Beidecha. That the Yesod of Torah Kinyanim is Gemar Das. The real thing is Gemar Das. All the Kinyanim are only symbolic, either to create Gemar Das or to prove Gemar Das. But what really transfers money from owner to owner, from Pliny to Almighty, from this to that, is Gemar Das. And the Chazon Ish's father writes, I think I saw a letter from Rabbi Loza Moshe Pinsker, one of the greatest Gedolim in Lithuania. Rabbi Loza Moshe Horovitz is the Rav of Pinsk. And he says the same. to the other side of the world, Reb Shloime Kluger, coming before the Chazon Ish, Reb Loza Moshe Pinsker, and the Chazon Ish's father, Tuftan Vedas, Shalosh Tuvas Chelek Aleph Simereish Samechtes, writes the same. Reb Yosef Engel Sionim L'Torah, Simen Lametes. All of these Gedolim had the very, very same feeling that the real thing is Gemara Das, and the Kinyanim are only necessary one of 2 points: to create Gemara Das or to prove Gemara Das. The very first Godel to write the same is the Pnei Yeshua and Gittin Avayin Zayin, but the Pnei Yeshua goes to a great extreme, and he says, when the Moicha says to the Lokeach, Lechazak v'kni, and then the Lokeach, a day or two later, makes the Kinyan is actually Chala Mafreya, Ma'amiris Lechazak v'kni. Because the Kinyan is only necessary to prove Gemara Das, and once they do prove Gemara Das, we assume that Gemara Das was there from the moment the previous owner told the potential buyer, Lech Chazak v'kni. So, all the previous sources I quoted are Lumdis, but the Pnei Yeshua is Machadash HaHalocha, and it's mind-boggling because we do not find this halacha in any edition in any major posek. And it's a Gevaldige Nafkamina HaHalocha. If a person's told another, Erev Sukkos, Lech Chazak v'kni, go to my stand in the shuk and take a lulav and an eslig, and he didn't go there, he didn't make the kinyan till Chalamoid. Is he koine lemafreya? Is he yotzi dechavasa lemafreya? Is it lochem lemafreya? According to the Pnei Yeshua, yes, and that is a gevaldige chiddush. So this is the fundamental approach of many achronim. I quoted just a few of them in my sefer. I quoted many more. Lani is daiti. I don't have a stira to the achronim, but I have powerful feelings. No. Mishachitshu Torah Kinyanim. The Kinyan is the real thing. And the Kinyan is what transfers money from one person to the other, from one institution to the other, from one body to the other. And there's no difference between Kiddushin and Gerushin, Yibum v'chalitza, and Kinyanei Mamoin, or Shichror Avodim. They're all the same. Every chalais demands Gemara Das. But the way I see it, Gemara Das is only there to enhance and to come along to give validity to the Kinyan. But the Kinyan is the real thing, just like Kiddushin and Gerushin. Contrary to what the Achronim feel, that it is only the Kinyan to accompany and enhance the Gemara Das, I think it's the other way around. And why do I think so? Few different reasons. Chodesh Yud Gimel, and in other sources in Shas, we learn a Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Both agree that Bnei Yisrael have one Kinyan and non-Jews another. According to Rabbi Yochanan, Kesef LeYisrael Mashiach LeNachrim. According to Rish Lakish, the other way around. Mashiach LeYisrael Kesef LeNachrim. And now, I don't understand. If the Kinyan is only necessary to prove Gemara Das or to enhance Gemara Das, why would there be a difference between a Jew and a non-Jew? Why? I mean, they don't have the same neshama, but they have the same mind, the same brain, so how strange it would be to say, Yisol Goymer Das bekesef v'nochri b'meshicha. And if there is logic to that assumption, how do we explain Rish Lakish that maintains the exact opposite? Yisur b'Mashiach v'goy b'kesef. What would be a machlokes? I have another question. A person did Geiris 5 minutes ago. So 10 minutes ago his Gemara Das depended on kesef, and now his Gemara Das depends on Mashiach. Same person, same psychology, same attitude and approach to business. This all proves very clearly that it's all hilchasa. It's not only logic, it is hilchasa. The Torah is mechadash kinyanim, and machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish is, what are the dina kinyanim b'Yisrael v'benochri? It does not depend on Gemara Das. Argument number 2, Even as a Chof Chasif Yud Gimel and Shulchan Aruch, there's a machlokes brought in the Rabbeinu Yerucham, quoted in the Bis Yosef, whether a kinyan derabanan mehana le diuraisa. Some kinyanim are only midrabanan. According to the B'Yochel Mashiach B'Yisoros Midrabanan. Is it valid when we come to need ownership to observe a mitzvah diuraisa, and it's a machloikas? Why would it be a machloikas? If the kinyan is only necessary to prove Gemar Das or to enhance Gemar Das, why would there be a difference between a kinyan derabanan and a kinyan diuraisa? Mishetiknu chachomim kinyonim, they prove Gemar Das. They create Gemar Das. Why would there be a question? Of course it's mahana diuraisa. Once again proves, no. It is the kinyan that transfers moment, not the Gemar Das. And that is why it is a legitimate question whether a kinyan derabona mahana diuraisa. Argument number 3. Each and every one of the kinyanim have details, very specific and sometimes minor details. And if those standards aren't met, the kinyan is invalid. Whether Egbo has 1 tefach or 3 tefachim. Which tefach? Reb Chaim nor the Chazon Ish. Kinyan Mashiach. There's a difference between Mashiach's Beim and Mashiach's Metaltel and Mashiach's Finna. How much do you need to move the object or the animal? And this is a major discussion. As I mentioned in Bava Masa, there's a difference between Behemoth, Finna, and Metaltelin. Why? Is there a way to explain, if I was Magbia Shnei Tfochim, there's no Gemar Das, Shlosh Tfochim, there is Gemar Das, and what's Machloikes Hashem Beinutam? All these details that are Ma'akev B'di'evet once again prove Dinei Torah, V'kachi Darka Shel Torah. Kachi Darka Shel Torah, V'kach Midas Chachomim, Arboam So Metayar, Arboam So Chosa Kortav, Lo Metayar. 3 tefachim is a kinyan, 3 tefachim chosa etzba is not a kinyan. But if it all depends on Gemar Das, this would be very, very difficult to explain. And that is why, in my opinion, there's no difference between kinyanim and kedushin and gerushin, k'zeh sakosef. But I do agree that in Kiddush, in Toldos moment, kinyanim have a logic, and they are based on a fundamental logic. And this is a big arichas I wrote and I spoke about many times. And I mentioned this to explain. There are various different sugas in Shas in which we find Gomer v'makna bahi anoah, and you don't need a kinyan. And according to all those achrayim, it's very logical. It's very logical. Because the kinyan is only here to prove Gemar Das, to create and enhance Gemar Das. So, in a situation in which anan sehade the gomer v'makna, a kinyan is not needed. How do I explain the Gemaras? So my approach would be somewhat more nuanced, but still very logical, I think. There is a difference between Toldos HaMomen and other areas of Torah, like Kedushin and Gerushin. After all, Toldos HaMomen is bein Adam l'chaveiroi. It's about money. It's not bein Adam l'mokim. But still, when a kinyan is needed, it is the kinyan that does the work. But when there is a certain level of Gemar Das and a certain nature of Gemar Das, a kinyan is not necessary. And Gemar Das alone could transfer momin meploini l'almoini. And where do we find an answer hada gomer v'makna? Either mitoch simchiyas seira or when it is necessary to perform a mitzvah or to abstain from an aveira. We find this concept by Mechilas Chumetz. We find the concept by Mechilas Bechor. Tshuvas Bekivege Chelakalav Simalamed Zayin. Person sold a behema mevakeres with only kinyan kesef, even though it's questionable. But Gomeva Makla and Bekivege quotes the Gemara and the Toises and Bchoris Yud Chesed Beis. Noired loy Bechor be'edroi, and one of his shepherds is a kohen. That kohen is kohen de Bechor. And why is that? Because it's a mitzvah to give a Bechor le kohen. Anan sehade. Gomer v'makna. So one scenario is mitzvah and the other is simcha yisera. Kiddushin Tesumit Beis, Ksubas Kuv Beis Amid Aleph, Omer Av Gidl, Kamat Anoisen Abincho, Kamat Anoisen Abitcho, Henen Advorim Aniknem Ba'amira. When Mechatona make a shidduch, and they're so happy, and each of them promises, takes upon himself to give Nedunya. That is a chiyuv even though they made no kinyan. Anan sahada. We find a similar svoren sometimes in Shas when we find the understanding is Kinyan Kesef, because Hanoah is defined as Shvei Kesef. So what's the klal? For instance, Bava Metziat Zayin, Reuven sold a field to Shimon, and then Shimon becomes aware the field doesn't belong to Reuven, and he sold it with zero authority. He sold Levi's field to Shimon. Shimon isn't koina. How could Reuven sell something that isn't his? But if Reuven worked out an agreement with Levi, then Shimon is koina mekanu lahabo. And the Gemara asks, Shimon has a shtar, but that shtar is worth nothing. Chas ba'alma, because that shtar was signed without authority. The Gemara says, Be'ahir noah dekumehem elei gomer v'matna. Reuven sold Shimon Levi's field. Shimon should be so angry. He should hit Reuven. He should hurt him. He should call him to court, to Beis Din. And Shimon says, I believe you, Reuven. You come to an agreement with Levi, and I will be quiet. Be'yehiyah noah de'loi tov elei bedina, be'yehiyah noah de'komehem elei, two Rishonim in the Gemara, Gomer v'makna. All the Rishonim, but Metziat Zayin, say it's Kinyan Kesef. So what is the difference between Moichasu de Gezula and Kamat Onoisen Labincho, Kamat Onoisen Labitcho? So in my form, I wrote two fundamental differences, and both are so powerful and so convincing. In the story of Kamat Onoisen Labincho, it is not something that one party does to make the other party happy. It is mutual, two-sided. Both mechatonim are happy. At least we hope so. If only one of them is happy, tzoros. So both are happy. So no party feels obliged to give something in exchange for what you did for me. I did nothing for you. I did for myself and my child. We're both overwhelmed with simcha and thankfulness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is not Kinyan Kesef. But when Reuven sells a field to Shimon, and it is not even Reuven's field, and Shimon doesn't fight Reuven and embarrass him and humiliate him and hurt him, then the Hanu is one-sided. It is only Shimon that was Mahana Reuven. It's not the other way around, and that is why Reuven feels obliged to reciprocate and to get that field for Shimon, and Shimon expects that as well, and that is Kinyan Kesef. The other difference is Danu direct or indirect. It is not Mechuten A did something for Mechuten B or the other way around. They're both happy that finally their children find the right shidduch and they're going to be happily married. So that is not Kinyan Kesef, but in the case of Reuven and Shimon, it is Shimon that directly causes happiness and benefit to Reuven by not destroying his life and not humiliating him. Those are the two differences, and that is why sometimes Be'ahino Gomer v'Makna is defined as Kesef, and in other cases it is the Kinyan itself, not necessitating any additional Kinyan. So as I explained, the way I understand it, the way I see it, when a Kinyan is needed, it is the Kinyan that transfers money, but sometimes when there is a high level of Gomer v'Makna, which is either based on mitzvah satira, the need to perform a mitzvah, or on Simcha Yisera, that is when Gomer v'Makna in itself is enough to transfer a moment and to validate an obligation, a monetary obligation that a party took upon himself, and in those cases, a Kinyan is not necessary. So, Minchas Osha Bava Basra, and once again, Minchas Osha Chumash V'Yukra Parshas Bahar, I went into great detail in these sugyas. And Be'ezes Hashem B'Korav, when the new the new edition of Minchas Oshar Torah will come out, it is far more elaborate. But at this stage, I just would recommend learn the Simunim that I wrote, and I brought many, many different sources in Shas, Rishonim, and Achronim, just to emphasize the fundamentals that I shared with you in today's Shiur. As you all know, my mother passed away a week ago, and I would like to share some points of her legacy, what we learned from her, and what so many others could learn from her. So my father passed away 6 years ago, short 1 month, Chav Zayin Kislev, 6 years ago. And my father was very well known. He was outgoing. He was a great Talmid Chacham. So many people know him, but few people really knew my mother. By the nature of things, Kol Kvuda Bas Melech Penima, but she was as amazing a personality as my father. Noshim b'may zachyon, Rav tells Rav Chia, Bakriya benayelo bekenishto, ubatnio gavrayu bevei rabbonon, vekunatren legavrayu ada osama bevei rabbonon. They take their chitz to cheder, they accompany their husbands and encourage them to go to the Beis Medrash to learn, and then they wait for them at home happily. And Rashi writes, Be'rabonon sham lamde Mishnah ve'Gemara. Why does it make a difference what they learn in yeshiva, whether it's Mishnah, Gemara, Tzos, and Asiris, or anything else? The very question, Noshem b'may zachyon, is a pele. Most of the mitzvahs are lo ta'aseh, and Noshem are chayav, and all the lo ta'aseh, most of the mitzvahs say ein azman gromen, and Noshem are included in those as well. It might be a surprise to you, but I think Noshem are mechuyev in most of the mitzvahs shazman grama. Kol sheyeshna b'shoma yeshna b'zochar, and that includes all the mitzvahs of Shabbos. Kol sheyeshna b'bal toichel chometz yeshna b'kum achron matzah, and that includes all the mitzvahs of Pesach. So there are only a handful of mitzvahs that Noshem aren't chayev. So what is the question? B'mei zachyon. It is obvious, yes, only very few mitzvahs, but the most important mitzvah is Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah keneged kulam, and Noshem apotem Talmud Torah, and every Jewish neshama needs a kesher to Talmud Torah, not only kiyum mitzvoseu ki heim chayenu v'oirech yumeinu. More than that, every Jewish neshama needs a kesher to Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. So I don't have the time now to discuss the essence of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebechsav is Kedushas HaGuf, and Torah Shebal Peh is Keneged HaNeshama. And that is why the Gemara says two things. Akruya benayula bekenishta, taking the kids to cheder, and what they learn there is primarily Torah Shebechsav. Vekunatrin legavrayu da oseme berabonon, writes Rashi, Mishnah and Gemara, Torah Shebal Peh. So my mother was extremely learned, extremely intelligent, and extremely inquisitive. She loved to learn, and she was thirsty for knowledge and for Torah. Just a few years ago, she initiated with a few neighbors to learn Mishlei. Did you ever meet a 90-year-old woman, I think she was 91 at the time, that initiates a shiur on Mishlei? I think that is amazing. And she always used to speak about encouraging the curiosity in children, and she said, when your child asks a question, never just brush him off. Show him how good his question is and how important it is to you, and try to think and come up with a reasonable response to his questions. Just encouraging his curiosity, encouraging him to really want to understand. And that is such an important lesson. And she learned all her life. In the past few years, anybody that came to visit, a son, a daughter-in-law, einiklach, ur einiklach, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, everybody had the Shiur Dvar Torah. And she used to warn them, if you don't say, you'll need to listen. If you don't say, I will say. Most of us preferred to listen and not to say, because we had so much to learn from her. She was amazingly intelligent, and sometimes she had profound insight into Torah. One of the thoughts that was a motto, one of her mottos was, we say every day, twice a day, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, V'yohavto Hashem Elokecho b'chol levavcho v'chol nafsho. How could a person achieve such a great level of Ahavas Hashem with all your heart and all your soul? B'chol levavcho v'chol nafsho. My mother used to say That is why Anshe Knesset Adela were metakan. Before you say Shema Yisrael, before you say you have to, you say Ahav Soilem Aftonu, Ahavu Rabu Aftonu, Chemlu Gedolu v'Yisrael Chomaltu Oleinu Oyev Am Yisrael. It is only when you appreciate how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves you that you will be able to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that same way. And love HaKadosh Baruch Hu she did. And she was always so thankful for all the beautiful gifts she got in her life. She was the happiest person I ever met, which is also so uncommon. Usually, elderly people, especially when they're not really healthy, are grouchy and they're complaining. And it's painful because most of the times there's nothing you could do to make them more comfortable or happy or better. My mother was such a pleasant person, and our grandchildren loved to go visit her because she never complained and she was always happy. 17 years ago, she had a debilitating stroke. Her left side was paralyzed. She couldn't use her arm. She could barely fighting using a walker. And we used to ask her, Mommy, how do you feel? And she used to say, well, I can't use my left hand and my shoulder hurts and my knees aren't carrying me, but I feel great. That's my knee, that's my shoulder, that's my hand, that's not me. I feel great. I am wonderful. And that was the way she lived, thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for every breath. She was so proud of her family, of her children and grandchildren. Baruch Hashem, my 6 brothers are all great Talmidei Chachomim and Marbitzei Torah Gedolei Yisrael, and she was so proud of that. A few months ago, came to visit her on Friday. Friday was my Kibbud Av V'Eim day, and I see her looking at the screen of her computer, and I'm giving a shiur, and she smiles and she's listening to the shiur. And when I came closer, I became aware that I'm teaching Hilchos Rebbeis. And my mother smiles and she says, I don't understand one word what you're talking about, but I love to see you talking and I love to see you teaching. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but I'm still enjoying. She was proud of her family and she was so, so connected to Torah. And she was always grateful and thankful. And another very, very fundamental part of her personality was she never could say a lie. And she was so emistic. So 17 years ago after the stroke, we asked for support from Bituach Lami, from Social Security, because she was a necha, she was disabled. So an asking came just to give her instructions when Bituach Lami will come down to check her out, what she should say. And it was explained to her, you need to say how hard things are and how much you need support. But she said, but I feel well. What do you mean you feel well? You can't use your left side. And she says, but I do feel it's getting better from day to day. So she was asked, when the people from Bituach Lomi come down, she shouldn't wear her sheitel, but she should wear a tichel, because she shouldn't look so good. And she says, but I never accepted a guest in my house if I wasn't presentable and mechubedik and wearing a sheitel. So we tried to explain to her, Mommy, these are not guests. They're not coming to have a coffee with you. They're not coming to visit. These are professionals. They're from Social Security. She says, no, I won't open the door if I don't look good. They came to visit her, and she was wearing a sheitel. She was at her best, and they asked, how are you feeling? She says, I feel great. So how about you walking? Could you walk? She says, not really, but I do feel it's getting better from day to day. You could imagine when they wrote their report, they said, she's feeling fine. She's getting better by day to day. She looks good. So we didn't get any support. But my mother would never, ever say something she doesn't feel, she doesn't believe. So Baruch Hashem, we had a schus. She was 93 years old. And a story she said 1,000 times. Yud Gimel Sivan. She arrived in Auschwitz. with close to 30 family members. They were all sent right to the grass chambers, and only she was sent left. She was 15 years old. She was terrified, and she thought that those Rishonim didn't notice, and she ran in the other direction to be together with her family. And Nazi ran after her, punched her in the face, and threw her. She flew about 10 feet, and she was dazed and hurt. By the time she got up and looked around, she no longer saw any one of her family members. Bal korchacho atu chai. Sadly, she went left to life. And that was a shkocha protis. Many times I thought, who was that guy that saved her life by punching her, by hurting her? Was it Eliyahu Hanavi? Eliyahu Hanavi would never dress up like a Nazi. No, it was the Sultan himself. But that is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted. She was spared. And 78 years later, she passed away, and she left 500 descendants. In her later years, she used to say, that's my revenge, that's my nekama in Hitler. 500 descendants, all are Yirei Shamayim, Baruch Hashem. Many of them, Marbitzei Torah. So I just shared with you a few points of her life, the way she lived and her personality, and halavai we should be able to emulate and pass all that over to our children, to our Talmidim, and to coming generations. She should be a Melech Yosef for the entire family and for Beis Yisrael. And we should only know Simchas and Achas and Beseres Tovis and Bekorei B'Yameinu B'Yas Mashiach Tzidkeinu B'Mheiro V'Yameinu Amen.